I'm Gretchen Marie Schaefer, and I'm the director of RMCAD's Visiting Artist, Scholar, and Designer program. The VASD program is an interdisciplinary initiative that values passionate curiosity and explores critical, diverse, and creative inquiry through a variety of events and presentations. We are very happy to enrich the academic experience for all of our students here at RMCAD and to serve the greater Denver metro community. It is very exciting to be launching the 2018-2019 VASD program year-long series called Fictions with tonight's presentation and exhibition by Jonathan Monaghan. Through April of next year, the Fictions series will investigate the complicated relationship between contemporary artists and veracity. In broad swaths of contemporary life and culture, notions of shared objective truths are currently being challenged and blurred in new ways. However, there is a long and rich history of artworks that intentionally mislead and falsify. In the context of art, these illusions are permitted, they're even expected and desired, and often wield the hoax as an instrument for truth. Beginning tonight, this series will explore what does it mean to create and revel in imagined and simulated worlds, uncanny characters, and magical actions at a time when the slippage between truth and fiction muddles our modern lives. And we begin the series with Jonathan Monaghan's Lavish Environments. This evening, we'll first hear from the artist with his lecture titled Fear, Myth, and Decadence in the Digital Age. And we'll have a bit of time for Q&A after the presentation. We'll then open the galleries to view his corresponding exhibition titled Synthetic Mythologies, which will include a reception with the artist. Jonathan Monaghan was born in Queens, New York, and currently is based in Washington, D.C. Past exhibitions and screenings of his work include the Sundance Film Festival, the Walters Museum of Art, the Frist Center for the Visual Arts, and the Palais de Tokyo. He has received numerous awards and residencies for his work, and his work has been featured in several media outlets, including the Washington Post, Vice, the Wall Street Journal, and the Village Voice. Monaghan's sculptures, videos, and prints explore historical iconography in the context of a contemporary life increasingly intertwined with digital technology. Drawing from multiple points of inspiration, including ancient mythology, science fiction, and corporate logos, those worlds are set in a high-gloss future, devoid of humans, lush with opulent interiors, floating in consumerist ecologies, occupied by mythical creatures with supernatural abilities. Produced using high-end computer graphics, these works appear real enough to touch, but their narratives and protagonists are fantastically allegorical. Nevertheless, these fabricated places and stories reflect very real anxieties surrounding authority, capitalism, and the uneasy relationship with the natural world. Monaghan's work and lecture offer a serious and at times humorous consideration of our present conundrum, where the obscuring of truth and fiction is so commonly felt as the confusing of digital and physical experience. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Monaghan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. That was such a great intro by Gretchen. I feel like I don't even have to say anything anymore. That was very eloquent. No, but thank you for having me here, and thank you for having me, specifically within this context of fictions. And, for me at least today, it just seems like the discrepancy or the difference between reality and fiction is just becoming more and more blurry, and it's just the difference between the two seems to be becoming greater and greater every day. And I think as Gretchen alluded to, we live in an era of, certainly fake news, and as Gretchen also mentioned, I live in Washington, D.C., and so I'm kind of seeing a lot of this kind of reality television show mixing with our elected office happening every day. And so, but it's not just, fake news, it's also things like virtual reality, right? It's also things like, the escapism that we deal with in terms of video games and in terms of entertainment. And these things tend to have this kind of blurring effect on this boundary between reality and fiction. And then also you have things on the macro level as well. You have things like climate change, and that's causing these kinds of disaster movies to happen, all around the world, and it causes this severe kind of imbalance and unpredictability in our lives. And then you also have something like this idea of supermodernity, something I'm interested in. This idea of places that are everywhere and nowhere, something like an airport or a Starbucks, where these spaces are, the same no matter where you go. You could go to Starbucks in Denver or in D.C. or in Mumbai, and it's the same thing, right? And so there's this great French philosopher who talks about how that affects your sense of reality, how that affects your sense of place, the way these kinds of globalized architectures proliferate throughout the world. So there's a lot of these issues that contribute to this kind of diffusion between reality and fiction, and it seems to me that technology is at the center of all of this. And technology, and then also kind of our kind of consumerist desires and our kind of consumerist culture, but it really seems like technology is this kind of this force in distorting our ability to differentiate between reality and fiction. And in semiotics, there's actually a term for this. It's called hyperreality, and this idea of consciousness being unable to differentiate between reality and a simulated version of reality. And so as an artist, I kind of work at the intersections of all these different things. So my work is very much kind of connected with playing with these boundaries and trying to draw attention to these boundaries and trying to distort them in interesting ways. And I do that in a number of ways, which I'll go over tonight. And but one of the ways that I really like to deal with this issue is through mythology. And the works that you're going to see in the galleries deal with this, specifically the animations in this gallery over here. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. So in my lecture tonight, I'm going to show a bunch of older work, and I'm going to show a little bit of what's in the shows, but I'm not showing too much of what's in the exhibitions because you're going to go see that after I'm done talking here. So I'm going to show some other work that's not in the exhibitions, as just as some kind of context. And that's what you're seeing here. This is a still from a 2015 computer animated film called Escape Pod. And in this film, we follow a golden deer through these different environments of wealth and authority. And so here we see a riot gear luxury store. So kind of like a Louis Vuitton store, but instead of selling handbags, it's selling riot gear, maybe to protect the 1% from the rioters at the gates or something, And so a lot of my work has these kinds of uncanny conflations where there's a series of kinds of imagery and elements that we're very familiar with, but that get conflated and distorted with other imagery, and that creates these kinds of very surreal and uncanny scenes. And first I want to show a little bit how people encounter my work, and also how you're going to encounter these films in the gallery. And so we say the word film, but nobody really sees my work in a movie theater usually. Nobody sees it in a kind of a start or stop, beginning and end kind of situation. All of my films are these seamless loops where they don't have a beginning or an end, and actually they don't even have cuts or edits. It's one kind of continuous camera shot through these different environments, and it kind of loops seamlessly. So people could kind of walk into the experience at any time, and there's not a set beginning or end. And they're typically installed in galleries or museum settings. Like here, it's installed at the New Frontier exhibition at Sundance in 2016. And so they're just typically displayed as a large projection or on a large monitor. And so they become like a window into this world. So they're not so much like a film, they're somewhere in between kind of a sculpture and a film experience. This is another installation of that piece in this hotel room in Barcelona. And so I talked a little bit about mythology, and this is again another installation of that same piece. And so this film follows a golden deer around these different environments. And so this has to do with hunting mythologies. And so we see the deer in hunting mythologies a lot. And one of the reasons why I'm so interested in mythology in my work is because there's this connection between nature and man. Mythology frequently deals with man's relationship to nature, human beings' relationship to nature. And so in the hunting mythologies, it has to deal with the chase and trying to get at something, trying to kind of obtain a kind of dominance over nature through the hunt. And so this film kind of interprets this history of hunting mythology. So we look at something like Diana the huntress on top of this golden stag. Diana, the Greek god of hunting, of course. And so I figure what I'll do now is I'll just kind of show a clip from this film. So this whole thing is about 20 minutes long, and I'm just going to show about 5 minutes of this clip of this film here, and then I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I'll start to show some other work. So. that's just 5 minutes. And so it's a 20-minute piece, and it goes on like that. The deer grows up in the duty-free shop, and then he kind of gets reborn. And so there's a lot going on in this, and I'll start to kind of unpack a little bit of this as I go through the talk. But one of the things that we saw in this scene with this kind of birth of this golden calf here, this golden baby deer, is a kind of almost a violent discordance between the natural and the synthetic. So oftentimes you'll see in my work this very strong kind of discordant juxtaposition between organic and kind of man-made forms of the organic and the artificial. And then also with this golden deer, we have this idea of myth and mythology. And so with what I do in a lot of these films is kind of create almost a new mythology that kind of builds on these kinds of ancient stories, but brings in contemporary imagery and contemporary sort of issues. And so mythology is, it's intimately connected to the human psyche. And it seems like it's almost something we tend to lose today as we get kind of caught up in the digital age. And so oftentimes what I'm trying to do in this work is trying to present or create a new mythology for the digital age, for kind of our time and our society, as a way to maybe cope with some of these kinds of massive issues that were alluded to in terms of how we're dealing with the digital age and technology today. So I'm not the first artist to begin working in this format, and what I mean by that is working using kinds of video, but in a gallery or museum context. So creating these kinds of digital animations, but not screening them in a cinema. And so these were two artists that were influential on me when I was your age, when I was developing my work in college. And so Jennifer Stein and Claudia Hart, and they were some of the first artists to use kind of computer animation in a context of contemporary art in the gallery museum space. And so another theme that kind of threads through my work is anxiety and fear, and the kinds of fears and anxieties we have about the future, and the fears and anxieties we have about technology. And so you saw some like kind of Wi-Fi routers on this little spaceship that was taking the deer up, and so where did this come from? Well, when I was your age, I kind of graduated college at the worst possible time, which was in the middle of the 2007-2008 financial global meltdown, right? And so you guys don't know how good you have it, right? Because I mean, nobody knew if like there was going to be any jobs. Nobody, people's money was disappearing. It was a really kind of scary time, and there was a tremendous amount of like dread and fear in the air. And as a person like leaving college, going out into the real world, it was just not a really fun environment to kind of leave college in. And so I was also in New York, and so which was the kind of epicenter of this financial collapse. And so it's this kind of this fear and this dread is fed into my work, and I think in significant ways. And it's also given me a kind of a suspicion about the foundations of our consumerist and capitalist society, right? Because the issues with that were shown very clearly in the middle of that crisis. And so that influenced my work in a lot of ways. Here we see a film from 2012. I'm not going to play a clip because we don't really have the time, but in this film we have these video game characters wandering around these mansions that were built by Wall Street banking titans. And so this is the Lehman House, which is still a building in New York that I recreated in the 3D software. And the Lehman Brothers were, of course, the major financial firm responsible for the 2008-2007 collapse. So this was kind of those original Wall Street bankers. And also, so fears about kind of consumerism and capitalism and the kind of these issues, but then also our fears and anxieties about the environment and how technology and our society is kind of destroying that, again, creating that discordance between the man-made and the natural world. And so this was a piece that I did in 2010, and I'll just kind of play it here while I talk over it. It's a silent piece. And it takes the familiar Coca-Cola polar bears, which you may be familiar with. I'll show a picture of them in a second. And it instead of having a good time in the North Pole like they are in the commercials, I took this kind of footage of a polar bear dying of starvation that was quite popular, and kind of recreated the movements of that polar bear. But he's kind of tattooed with these corporate logos, with these Coca-Cola logos. And so it's about a 3-minute piece, and it kind of goes on like that. And this is, again, installed in a gallery space, or installed as this, kind of giving it this almost sculptural presence. And so here's projected life size, like what the size of a real polar bear would be. And so you're kind of really presented or confronted with this form, with this kind of dying animal in the gallery space. And with the projection, it takes on a kind of a ghostly presence, a kind of a ghostly image in the space. And additionally, here's the the Coca-Cola imagery that's referencing. And also another issue with this was actually the first commercial that was made entirely using computer graphics, which was kind of cool. So it's kind of like my homage in a way to Coca-Cola polar bears. And as part of that project, I sent out these kind of unsolicited letters to people as this kind of weird gesture. And so, this was an art collector in D.C. And so I sent her these. I sent a bunch of people these unsolicited letters, and they just had these antiquated Coca-Cola taglines in them. So this says, "Dear Andrea, whoever you are, whatever you do, wherever you may be, when you think of refreshment, think of ice cold Coca-Cola." And then I got like this wax, like old seal wax, and I 3D printed my own like wax seal for this, but it looked like blood coming out. So it was really, kind of trying to also bring the work outside the computer. And I'll talk a little bit about this today, but my background is in the virtual space. It's not in the art space. I studied 3D modeling and animation before I knew anything about art. And so my challenge as an artist has always been to how to bring this imagery out into into an art space where it has the context that I'm looking for. And so I put in this lecture this idea of decadence, and this is something. This is a word that I like to use to refer to some of these issues that we've been talking about. So not just the shaky foundations of capitalism, but also the that financial crisis. It also caused a significant amount of inequality. Global income inequality shot up after the financial crisis, and it hasn't really regained since. And so this kind of disparity between wealth, this kind of absurd amounts of wealth, is something that you see a lot in my work. So again, that kind of the duty-free shop and the luxury riot gear store. And so, but also decadence means decline. It comes from etymologically speaking, it has to do with decline. And it was used to refer to the kind of ostentatiousness of the Baroque era. And you'll see a lot of Baroque imagery in my work as well. And so I'm trying to maybe equate those two things together. And so here's kind of what I mean. So this is another still from Escape. We didn't get to see it in the video, but this is also part of that same film, and we fly through this luxury riot gear store. And again, this was 2015, and there was, it was after Occupy, and there was a lot of these issues going on in the world. And so I was thinking about, this idea of the 1% and how that kind of closes off, how there's like this kind of exclusivity associated with that. Again, this kind of decadence. And so kind of how I begin to make some of this imagery is, I'm looking at, it's very imaginative worlds, right? But I'm looking at real world situations. So this is just a, Louis Vuitton store in Hong Kong. And so I kind of appropriate a lot of this kind of design elements, a lot of these kind of architectural and interior design elements to create my virtual spaces. And likewise here in that bedroom scene, which we did watch in the Escape Pod film, we have this, this advertisement for like, luxury walk-in closets, and you can see this in like a fancy magazine or something. And so what's also interests me about these spaces and these aesthetics is that everything is so slick and refined and everything, but there's no people in it, right? There's no people in these advertisements. And for me, advertising, and especially when we're dealing with wealth and when we're looking at this thing, advertising is supposed to like give you an aspiration, right? You're supposed to aspire to what you see in these advertisements. Yet we seem to be obsessed with these very kind of cold, clinical kinds of aesthetics when we deal with when we look at a lot of these advertisements. And so that kind of interests me. I'm trying to point that out in my work. And I'm trying to work implicitly with those kinds of visual aesthetics, that sharpness, that glossiness. I'm kind of working complicitly with that as a way to kind of subvert it and undermine it. And so again, you see the kind of relationship between my worlds and kinds of these things. So I'm appropriating a lot from the commercial world, appropriating a lot of commercial imagery. It's another series of work. prints as well. So as Gretchen said, I make the films. I also make sculptures and prints. So this was a series of prints that were done around the same time as that film we just watched. And they're based off the Fabergé egg. The Fabergé egg, of course, being this kind of symbol of decadence, being the symbol of wealth. And also, people want it, right? People always are trying to get the most expensive Fabergé egg or whatever. It's this kind of a symbol of one's wealth and power. And so I was interested in that idea, and was interested in how to maybe convert that for, what are our aspirations, what in terms of contemporary society. And so we had things like a Starbucks in one of them. What was cool was I got to actually exhibit these works alongside original Fabergé eggs at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. So this is a museum that has 2 of the original eggs in their collection. And so they put on a whole show about Fabergé, and then they have a kind of contemporary art section of it with my work, with a little solo exhibition of these 5 prints that I created. And so, this imagery, we have things like Starbucks, we have kind of consumer electronics that make up these Fabergé eggs. So in place of the jewels and the diamonds and the gold enamel, we have pieces of furniture, pieces of electronics, and corporate logos. I remember I mentioned Starbucks before too, and that also plays into the film in there as well. And likewise, too, thinking about Starbucks and thinking about symbols, and symbols are very connected to mythology. And so here I take the Starbucks logo and invert it and turn it into a kind of satanic object. And so this is a large kind of wall sculpture piece, and you have this like fake fur coming out of it. And so also kind of creating that discrepancy or that weird sort of feeling between the natural and the synthetic. So you have this kind of smooth surface, it's a corporate logo, but then it has this kind of soft fur coming out of it. And so with a lot of my works, you're not quite sure if things are alive or if things are synthetic or what. And I like to kind of try and find these weird liminal spaces between the kind of the natural world and the artificial. And so, why Starbucks and why all of this stuff? Well, I'll give you a little bit about my background as well. So I grew up in Rockaway Beach in Queens, and this is a photo of Rockaway. That's where it is if you've ever been to New York. It's like this little appendage that hangs off of Queens there. And the Ramones wrote a song about it, by the way. So, and this is the housing complex I grew up in, and so. Rockaway was one of those places, and you were noticing it in Denver here too, and where I live now in Washington D.C. It seems to be happening a lot. Is that it's kind of completely changing. The fabric and the nature of these neighborhoods are really changing in quite dramatic and sometimes very serious ways. And so and Starbucks seems to be that kind of one of those like a Whole Foods or a Starbucks. Like once those pop into town, it's like the gentrified area, right? And so there's almost like a violence to this, right? And you can't like stop it. And there's how do you fight it? You don't know. It's like this unstoppable force, right? And so this idea plays into my work a lot as well. And thinking about New York, and this is a city that's changed so significantly in my lifetime. When I grew up there, it was not the fortress for the rich that it is today. And we see these glass condos popping up, and we're seeing this in Denver too. And so I'm looking at these advertisements for these very expensive multi-million-dollar condos, and there's something about them. And again, these are artificial imagery, right? So all these condos were sold through these kinds of 3D renderings, the same software I'm using, but there's also, there's no people in them. There are these very dehumanized spaces. And again, this is supposed to be aspirational, right? This is supposed to be something that you want. It's supposed to make you want these things. And so I'm trying to kind of unpack what is that? What is it about our aspirations today that are so dehumanized and are so cold and clinical? And so I was interested and did a lot of research and kind of downloaded all these renderings of these different spaces. Here's another one. And this was kind of the impetus for the series of artwork that you'll see in here on this side. And it's a series called Police State Condo. And so they're the series of digital prints. So they're created using the same techniques that the films are created in. They're just presented as a flat printed imagery. And we see these spaces that reference these kind of luxurious, high-end apartments or kinds of corporate lobbies. And instead of populated by humans, we have these strange robotic-like forms that are sort of hovering in these spaces. And these forms are meant to be very intimidating. They have security cameras and weird technological components popping out of them. And so it's meant to create this almost alien presence in these very familiar spaces and situations. So here's another one that's in there. And so when you get, and these are meant to, when you go see them in the gallery, these are meant to, you're supposed to go up close to them and look at the details. And there's a lot of small details that I place in here that I think are interesting to note. For instance, like these kinds of X-ray scanners, these kinds of naked X-ray scanners that you go through at the airport, these TSA things, and security cameras and other things like that. Things that have a very kinds of aggressive presence in what's supposed to be this like domestic space. Here's another one. And you could see some details here. So ATM machines, and there's a lot of imagery associated with finance in these as well. And in fact, all of these works are named after the slogans of defunct banks that went defunct after the financial crisis. And so this is called Fluent in Finance, which obviously wasn't the case for that bank that went defunct, and so all that you could get the sheet with all the names on them and look at all the names of these different pieces, and so a little ironic there. And this one also has like a city bike, and this is another thing that is kind of this sign of gentrification, right? When the neighborhood's about to get more expensive is when you start to see these bike shares and things like that popping up, and so and what you also see here are these sort of, again, this weird organic imbalance between the synthetic, and so we have these like leather elements that almost become flesh-like in a way. And there's also this idea of sort of entrapment, and so in this one and in this one too, we see these kinds of spaces here that they seem to kind of trap you in with this kind of velvet rope, and in here with the bike shares, they're kind of trapping you in a little bit. And this idea came from, it was related to the other film that you'll see in here, which is called Disco Beast, which is about a unicorn. And the impetus for this film, which is in there, and I'll show another still from it, it's the one that's on all the posters or whatever. The impetus for this was this tapestry. And the general kind of mythology surrounding the unicorn. And in this tapestry, it's in the cloisters at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We have a unicorn sort of trapped in this fence. And again, the unicorn was related to these hunting mythologies, which I alluded to earlier, where people are trying to capture the unicorn for its superpowers, or people thought that the horn would make them invincible or whatever. And so here we have the unicorn sort of trapped in this small fence. And what's interesting is that when the Met is describing this, when they're writing about it, when you read about it from their website, or they talk about how the unicorn looks like he could escape if he wanted to, but he seems pretty content being kind of trapped in this small space. And I think that's a very interesting metaphor for our relationship to technology today, because we're so addicted to it, and we don't seem to have any control over it anymore. And it's really sort of kind of entrapped us in this situation that we're in. And I mean technology, but then also kind of consumerism as well, and our materialistic desires. These seem to have this sort of entrapping quality to them, and they're kind of confining us in a way. And so that was kind of the impetus for this piece. And we see when we watch the film, we'll watch the unicorn in these very kinds of corporate spaces, these very clinical, cold spaces. He's in a Starbucks, he starts in a Starbucks. And with all the works, though, there's always this kind of rebirth cycle. And so the unicorn will, I don't know if I'm going to ruin it for you, but he dies at one point in it, and then he kind of comes back to life. And so this is where the mythology comes in, this sort of idea of rebirth. And I'm doing this because I really think that in the digital age, we need to have these kinds of stories and these mythologies, because we seem to be kind of floating, and the digital age has this significant effect on us and on who we are. And so I think by trying to present a new mythology, we could kind of create almost like a point of purchase over it, and we could deal with some of these issues that we're dealing with, this kind of discrepancy between reality and fiction, and how technology sort of distorts that. I think we could begin to maybe gain more control, get some control back on technology if we look past to these myths that have stuck with us for thousands of years. If we could begin to reimagine them and kind of reconnect to that human psyche, I think we could begin to get, maybe get out of this situation or something. And so, just a couple other quick notes. This film is about 18 minutes, and you'll see it in there, and there's a soundtrack, and I collaborate with musicians on the soundtrack for my pieces. And there's also another piece, which I don't have a still of, in this room on a monitor that has to do with the Phoenix. And again, the Phoenix is all about the rebirth. And so you'll watch that. And again, this is another kind of example of how these works are exhibited as these kinds of large scale. I like to think of them as these windows into these other dimensions, these other worlds. And so after the talk tonight, I invite you to go in there and kind of jump into my world, into these worlds. And hopefully after you get out of it, you could maybe have a slightly different perspective on the world that we're in today, and thus how fiction can help get us back to that sense of reality. So anyways, thank you. So we have a bunch of time for questions, if there are any. Are we doing mics with the questions?
Yeah, we got mics.
Okay.
Could you kind of explain how you, instead of going into the commercial, you went into the gallery space?
I think what happened was, it was just, in the program that I was in, the New York Institute of Technology, there was a lot of art professors, and it was in New York, and I was kind of doing internships with galleries. And so really up until like my senior year, I was like, I wanted to work, for Pixar, make video games. I wanted to work in this commercial space. But I began to, just kind of befriend a lot of the artist professors that were teaching there. And I just, I really felt this weight of these issues that we're talking about today. I really kind of felt that as like a weight, and I felt like art was a way to begin to rectify some of these issues, and I felt like I had something to say, and I felt like I could use these technical skills to say that. And so, and I found that the context of an art gallery or art museum is really this great way to begin this discussion, because you offer as kind of a space for reflection and intellectual kind of critique and thought and dialogue. And so I began to kind of create these animations for the gallery space, and I went to grad school for that, and that's kind of what brought me to my career where I'm at today. But I might have one of those condos if I stuck with the commercial space. I don't know.
I see that your lighting and your textures and your models are like on point. And so do you work on this by yourself? Because that's a lot of work for one animator.
So I do this all by myself. All these films are done 100% on my own. And they take a while. I do a lot of things. I do the prints, I do the films, I do sculptures. But these films that go about 18 minutes, 20 minutes or so, I make about one a year, so they take a long time. And I just use this. I use my laptop. And, one of the things that really drew me to 3D animation in the first place was back in high school, where I would, just kind of download the software and teach it to myself. And I don't know, looking back, I think one of the reasons why I did that, not having a social life or anything like that, just like, going into my parents' basement, just like, working with 3D Studio Max or Maya and like teaching myself all this stuff, was because there was just this unlimited potential for image creation. And like specifically, you didn't need a budget. If you wanted to make a film, you need a budget, you need to hire actors, you need cameras, all this expensive equipment. For 3D animation, you don't need any of that. You just need time and imagination. And anything you could come up with, you can do using this software, at least theoretically. And so that just felt really empowering to me, and I just really gravitated towards that. And I really loved this idea of just being able to make any image or any moving image that you could conjure up and make it happen, make it a reality. But actually also back then, one of the things that really interested me about the software was this ability to create a deceptive image, to create something that could be mistaken for a photograph, to create something, as we say, photorealistic. And so that quality really also interests me. I was really, really excited about trying to create images that can be, that are deceptive like that, that can appear almost like a photograph. And I really liked, that kind of, that balance. And I think that's carried into this work, but even though this is more referencing a kind of commercial aesthetic, these thick glossiness of like a car commercial or an Apple store or something like this.
So I was just wondering, what originally inspired you to blend fiction with reality, and is that something that you've always done, or is it something that you were inspired to do at some point?
Yeah, well, I think it's helpful. So, I mean, you could have something like, a fantasy movie or something like that, where it's a total fantasy, where it's 100% completely like its own world, like Lord of the Rings or something, right? And that's cool. I mean, it's amazing stuff. But for what I want to say, it helps to bring in these elements like a Starbucks, or it helps to bring in these elements from our everyday experience and to transform them into something kind of magical and mystical. I think that process is more interesting to me. So it really becomes about trying to create something that's familiar yet unsettling at the same time. And so that's what I'm trying to do. Is work is unsettling, and you'll see it as you kind of go through it. It's intentionally unsettling. It's confrontational, and it's supposed to kind of get you out of your comfort zone a little bit. And and there's nothing wrong with fantasy and all that stuff, but it doesn't provide that sense of edge or that instability that I'm looking for. So having things from the real world kind of come in there is important.
So have you ever considered any other mediums that could possibly, show your idea anymore, but have you ever considered like 2D animation or anything like that?
Mm-hmm. Something about the virtual space interests me, right? And everything I do some sculptures, which I didn't show today, but I do some sculptures, and they're all created using digital fabrication techniques. So the sculptures are coming out of the same space that the animations and the prints are coming out of as well. And so everything I do really revolves around this intangible virtual space, which I think is really interesting. And again, it gets to this idea of our inability to differentiate between simulated reality and reality or whatever, And so everything comes from this 3D, these 3D spaces. And so I don't know, it just doesn't make sense for me to do anything else. I can't really draw, so. I tried, Yeah.
Would you do anything with 3D or virtual reality?
I've experimented with it. As you'll see when you see these videos, there's something a little bit more social about them. Like you could, sit next to somebody, you could walk around them, you could be with 10 people watching them at the same time, and I like that. And they're not meant to be, and there's nothing wrong with doing virtual reality. It's a very powerful medium. I know a lot of artists that are doing really cool stuff with it. But for me, I just didn't it was too impersonal. It was too just about, your experience, and it's supposed to be kind of, and I think you'll notice this as you walk in there, as you start to have this kind of social experience as you're seeing these works, which I like, more. And again, that's why you have them in the gallery space and not, watching them in a theater or on your laptop or something like that. They're meant to be experienced as these physical objects.
So as a commercial animator, I know that you can make pretty solid money, and I know this is kind of a personal question, but I'm just curious how you support yourself, because I don't want to be a commercial animator. I want to be a gallery animator. Right. So I'm curious, like you're saying you're making one film a year. How do you support yourself as an animator who's only making one film a year?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not easy, and there's a number of ways, I think, and it's just the way any artist kind of works. I'm finding this slide, it's just the way any artist works. So there's a number of ways in which I think, just in terms of a practical perspective, you can kind of make this work. I mean, when you show, there's oftentimes, a screening fee or an honorarium associated with the gallery showing. I work with commercial galleries, so I work with a commercial gallery in New York called Bitforms Gallery and a commercial gallery in Paris, and they sell objects, like they're trying to sell this, or of course those don't happen nearly as often as I would like, but so there is this opportunity to sell work, and the videos also get sold. So one of my films, for instance, sometimes they go to private collectors, sometimes they go to public museums. So Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas, a huge museum, big American art collection. They have one of my films, and so museums could acquire the films, and then I also do some teaching too on the side. So that kind of makes it work, but it doesn't work as well as,
All right, last question.
What are some of the challenges that you have faced as this kind of artist work? Like, why is it that you chose this, and what are some of the things that you've kind of struggled with as in using this style?
Yeah. Well, and like I said, one of the first slides was those two artists, Jennifer Steinkamp and Claudia Hart, who were some of the first artists to use, kind of computer animation at least there's a long history to that, but they were some of the first like really prominent artists to do it really well and big time, and but it's taken a while for the kind of larger contemporary art world to maybe just accept this stuff. It's a lot of more traditionally minded folks in the contemporary art world. They don't necessarily see this as art, and so it's starting to take a new generation and a new series of programming. Like the Supernova is a great example of this, of trying to bring some more of this kind of avant-garde animation into public awareness. And so. That's always trying to be a challenge too, because people see this stuff. They think, is this a commercial? What is this? They don't really see it as an art object necessarily. And so that's always been a challenge, trying to bring this into the contemporary art world. But it's definitely happening. More and more artists are using this every day, and it's you can't ignore it. It's such a powerful medium, and it's similar to the history of photography in that way. Photography took a long time to be kind of accepted into the canon of contemporary art. I see 3D animation, computer animation is something similar to that.
All right, everybody, let's give it up for Jonathan one more time. Thank you so much. Thank you.